Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Alex Fraser. I'm the COO of Cass Business School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the school this evening. We are absolutely delighted to be hosting the inaugural World Traders Tacitus Debate. We are a business school in the City of London. I used to be able to say we're the only business school in the City of London. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. Now we are the leading business school, I hope, in the City of London. And we have very strong links to the city and its institutions. The Chancellor of City University, which is our parent university, is the Lord Mayor. And a number of Cass academics have been working closely with city folk in their search for the way of restoring trust in the city and its institutions. But most of all, we bear the name of Sir John Cass, and that gives us strong links to the livery world. John Cass was a very well-known figure in 18th century city. He was master of two companies. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but he started off as master of the carpenters and then switched his allegiance to the master of the Skinners Company, which was a very influential company at the time and contained amongst its members many of the most successful traders and merchants of the day. And Cass, as part of his political campaign to become alderman of the city, decided to found a school for 50 boys and 40 girls in a churchyard not far from here. And what started out as a political vote winner, if we're going to be cynical about it, became a strong passion for Sir John and for his wife, and the foundation that looked after his legacy, considerable legacy, enabled us to build this fantastic purpose-built school in 2001. And for those of you who've known the institution for some time, you will know that we came from the depths of the Barbican, so this was a real brave new world for us. At Cass, we have over 3,500 students from over 120 countries. So this year we welcome students from Belarus, Mongolia, Zambia, the list is endless. They study across a portfolio of undergraduate, master's, MBA, PhD programs. And as a business school, we're obsessed with rankings, and we live and die by them. Many of our programs are ranked in the top 2 or 3 in the UK. And many of our 300 academics have outstanding research reputations in finance management and actuarial science. And many too have professional backgrounds, and I think that's what gives us the very unique blend of academic rigor and practical insight. In recent years, the university has invested both in academic excellence, but also in facilities. And last year we opened brand new premises for our executive teaching in Aldersgate. So that then is Cass in a nutshell. I remember my Latin master at school. He said, Tacitus's game was brevity, so I hope I've been true to Tacitus. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Heather McLaughlin, who's master of the Worshipful Company of World Traders, to the stage, who's going to introduce tonight's event and our very distinguished panelists. Thank you for coming to Cass. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and I'd like to add my welcome to this first World Traders Tacitus Debate. I'm particularly pleased to welcome representatives from 5 schools that we support: Christ's Hospital School, City of London School for Girls, City of London Academy, St Dunstan's College and Westminster. As well as students, as well as the pupils from schools, we have students from our kind host, Cass Business School, many of whom are studying for the MSc in Energy and Finance. Such an event would not be possible without the support of the Commercial Education Trust and our sponsors, Cavendish Nuclear and Price Bailey, and we're very grateful to them. The debate is a new initiative to follow on from our annual Tacitus lecture, now in its 27th year, and this took place in February in the Guildhall. Angela Knight, Chief Executive of Energy UK, had us all enthralled by the energy trilemma, and we were delighted that she agreed to be on the panel this evening to debate the question, is energy just another power game? Along with other high-profile figures, Alistair Buchanan, Neil Eckert, James Smith and Professor Michael Tamvarkis. Energy is a very emotive subject these days, and everyone has an opinion. Media coverage has created a lot of misinformation, and it's often difficult to get a balanced view. It's an industry of increasing and welcome competition, but one which continues to require substantial amounts of investment. Energy plays a vital role in the economy and its continued recovery, but there are some tough choices to be made over the coming years in order to meet demand as well as balance aspirations for the climate change agenda. In the Tacitus lecture, Angela highlighted the need for an open and honest debate with the people led by policymakers to ensure a proper understanding of the range of issues and the all-important economic implications. I hope that this evening will be a step in that direction. Our chairman is the multi-talented Alderman Professor Michael Manelli. His CV makes very impressive reading. He's an expert in financial services as well as energy. He was a lead partner on one UK electricity board privatisation and quality assurance partner on another. He's currently advisor on alternative energy generation, storage and transmission. But before I hand over, I'll exercise my prerogative as Master World Trader by posing a question of my own to the panel, and that is, when would we know we have a workable energy policy? I hope you enjoy the evening, and we encourage you to tweet using the hashtag Tacitus2014. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Heather. I just love the notion that you got your retribution in first. So, classic rugby style. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Tacitus debate. As Heather said, on Thursday, the 27th of February, Angela Knight, Chief Executive of Energy UK, gave this lecture on Is Energy Just Another Power Game? And like any good lecture, we had a tremendous number of questions which arose. And a lot of comments. It was too complex. What about negawatts, reducing consumption? What about energy storage? What about the poor? What about rates of return? It's a big, rich Christmas pudding of a topic, and I think Angela opened it up extremely well, which of course left us with the what do we do as a follow-up? And we thought, well, the best thing to do was to engage a wider audience. The core, I think, to Angela's talk was the conflict between environmental policy, economic energy policy, and pandering to consumers. And she concluded that things really do need to change. A few facts just to get us going. One of the biggest issues, as we saw, was the conflict between the carbon agenda and the energy agenda. And I pointed out that gross worldwide emissions are about 7 billion tons of carbon. That's about a ton per person on the planet. And emissions are projected to grow to about 14 billion tons by the middle of the century. So for long-term stability, it's really quite simple. If we're going to keep it at about 7 billion tons of emissions, and we could have a debate about that, that's about 1 ton a person. But that means each Briton needs to reduce by about 10 tons. These are all round numbers, but economists say that it'll cost us about 25 to 50 euros per ton per year. That's 250 to 500 euros per person per year. That's about 1,000 euros to 4,000 euros per 4-person family per year. In a country that whinges about an annual £145.50 television license. So there's a lot of change in the offing. The UK has about 1% of the world's population and emits about 2.2% of the greenhouse gases. And the FTSE alone is producing about 1.6% of global greenhouse gases. So there's a lot here that needs to change, we would think. Funnily enough, I've been in the environmental sector since the 1970s. I had my first debate on climate change in the city in 1984. That is not a chairman's mistake, that's a fact. There are a lot of bright people who know that this has been going on. In 1997, we had Kyoto. In 2005, the governments of Europe swore that they would keep the price of carbon on the ETS above 25 euros a ton. I daren't think where it is today, but somewhere around 4. But Neil will probably tell me better. Giuseppe Tassami di Lampedusa, who wrote a fabulous book, Il Gatto Pardo, The Leopard, about the Sicilians not wanting to change during the course of the formation of Italy. And he says in that book, possibly the most famous phrase from the book, Se vogliamo che tutti rimanga come è, bisogna che tutto cambi. If you want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And Angela, I think, in February, was the kid who told you that Santa Claus didn't exist. UK energy policy is a lie for children, alongside Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, Nessie, Immaculate Conception, evolutionary design, and honors on merit. I think these are things that are here. So we're going to try and take this forward. So our panel have been very kind, and they've provided CVs, which saves me a lot of time, and possibly mumbling over things I can't pronounce. But on the very far left, we have Michael Tambakis presenting the academic view. To my immediate left, Alistair Buchanan, who was a banker, then became a regulator, and as he said just a few moments ago, is now back earning real money. Angela Knight, of course, you know. Neil Eckert, a fantastic serial builder of big businesses, both in insurance and in the environment. And on the far right, John Smith, who heads up one of the primary organizations in the UK dedicated to decarbonization. So if it's not far enough, if the policy is unachievable, Angela left us with the question, which I think will dominate this evening: who pays, how much, for what? Now, this is not a debate. Somebody once compared me not to Jeremy Paxman, but to Bill Nighy, which I think was a compliment. But I'd like you to combine the intellectual incisiveness of Jeremy Paxman, perhaps with Bill Nighy's gentle demeanor. So we'll have that kind of question time debate, but perhaps without some of the emotion. And just to walk you through the agenda as I see it, but you will be taking it where you wish, I'm going to ask, after I close in a minute or two, each one of the panelists to make a single big 2-minute point. And in fact, I have a big single 2-minute clock here, so we will keep them to it. And then I will turn to Angela, who will respond briefly, and then it will be over to you. And I see this very much in 3 parts, reflecting Angela's talk in February. The first part will focus on the energy trilemma for about 15 minutes. The energy trilemma was: how do we provide supply, meet carbon targets, and control price? The second part, also about 15 minutes, will focus on generation and competition issues. And in the third part, for about 15 minutes, can the UK deliver? Now, if you're there adding up all of this, don't worry, I've done that too. We then have 15 minutes for the panelists to make a quick closing comment. And then if I've done my job properly, we'll end at 19:59 and head out for some well-deserved drinks. So that's the program for this evening. If there's no objections to the program, nobody seems to have walked out yet. Obviously, I'm not doing my job very well. I would like to start, if I could, with the 2-minute point. And if I could begin, please, Neil Eckert.
Right. Good evening, everybody. I suppose my 2-minute point would centre around what is the real, true economic value of energy security. And the point was made, when would we know whether we have a successful energy policy? For me, if this country can ever become self-sufficient in its energy, it's removed some enormous risks. We have seen the creation of vast amounts of wealth in the Middle East, coupled with latterly vast amounts of political instability. We are somewhat beholden to people like Russia, especially some parts of the EU, which affects our foreign policy. So the cost of 1 megawatt could be a very, very small part of the equation versus foreign policy, volatility in financial markets, and other economic factors. So that's my real question. It is absolutely, to me, vital that, and technology must be out there to do this. Michael talks about power storage. I'm a great believer in small-scale distributed power, where people can be more in control of their own destiny. And I question whether the debate solely revolves around, as I say, today's power bill, because there are so many hidden costs in managing the energy marketplaces. Have I done?
You've done
am I within
brilliantly,
my-
Neil.
Thank
You get the under 2-minute award for sure. Michael, would you like to kick off with your 2-minute point?
Indeed. My point is about what is the second lemma of the trilemma, the inevitable prospect of increased demand, which remains, I think, unquestionable. It tends to be one of the most neglected aspects of the debate, as one simply assumes that demand will grow and we will just have to scramble and secure adequate supply. Looking at electricity consumption figures, one would say that the UK has done quite well in moderating growth in energy demand. Electricity consumption peaked in 2005 at about 400 terawatt hours and has been coming down since then, with the exception of 2010. Per capita consumption has been coming down, and so has electricity consumption per pound of GDP. And some would say that this is the result of increased energy efficiency, but many would simply point out low economic growth and an apparent persistence of energy poverty on the one hand and energy waste on the other. When we look at the surprisingly low rates of all the housing stock with adequate energy efficiency, we start getting an idea of how much more can be done by each and every one of us in order to consume more moderately and more wisely. Many commercial and public sector buildings, including, unfortunately, the one you are currently sitting in, still have low energy ratings. There is still quite a lot that needs to be done to improve this as well. My short point is consume less when possible, but mostly consume more wisely as household, businesses, and industry, all of us. It may be more difficult to change habits and overcome inertia, but it will be a more effective way to reduce pressure on supply, particularly in the short and medium term, and meet the carbon emissions targets in the long term. The recently rebooted Green Deal, which now features prominently on DEC's website, homepage actually, and the National Grid's offer to pay companies to cut their consumption during peak times this winter may be signs that demand-side management in all its different guises can have a more vital role to play. Thank you.
Neil, Michael, thank you. Alistair.
Thank you. 2 minutes, actually 2 requests to those in power. Firstly, give clarity to the rules, and secondly, please, please, please then leave the sector alone. The UK is surprisingly attractive to investment at the moment. This would seem odd to anybody looking at a newsstand today with either Blackout Britain or Rip-Off Britain facing them. But compared to events, say, in Spain or Germany, we are and need to be able to remain an attractive investment destination. Now, I can explain why in Q&A, but I've got rid of that. Let's just have a look if we don't maintain this investment attraction. Let's not get smug. Investors are worried currently, and genuinely so. Why? They're worried by incessant changes to the rules. In energy markets, we've seen rule changes in solar, wind, biomass in the last 3 months. It's difficult to keep up. In networks, we've seen a cost of capital debate that fully hadn't been worked through. We're worried by hearing a leading company at its results meeting saying that they're going to sue the government. We're worried by trying to understand how retail markets will ever get clarity and be left alone. The options for retail lie between the hardcore Austrian economic school and at the other end a loosely defined but very strongly held beliefs group who broadly want single tariff, simplicity and control. This is made more dramatic by the passion of the two lobbies. Now, interestingly, investors can probably live with either outcome as long as they get, one, government and politics leaving the retail supply sector alone, either during and definitely after the CMA review, and two, the regulatory structure is clear. Let me pose you to end with a brief question, and a primary reason given for the CMA is to improve public trust and confidence. So if the findings of the CMA are nothing to hide, my lord, all clear, do we really think the politicians are going to leave it alone? But if the findings are we have a problem, Houston, then the Competition Authority will, rightly given its remit, promote pro-competition answers. But do you think that that will then allow prices to be what they will be, higher margins to let in competition, no public commentary on margins allowed at all, letting tariff options multiply? If you have doubts after I've gone through that list, then frankly, we are going to have expended a huge amount of resource, intellectual and financial, in the next few years to end up where we began.
Thank you, Alistair. Well, that's absolutely fantastic. If I could turn to you, James, for the...
Yeah, thanks,
Fine.
Michael. I was just thinking about the statistics you gave us at the beginning, and if I may just add another statistic to some of the things you were saying. If we're going to lick climate change, we have to improve the energy efficiency of our economies by a factor of 3 in the first half of this century. And we have to reduce the carbon intensity of energy by 2/3. So this is a gigantic change. I happen to believe it's doable, and doable at affordable cost, but not necessarily as cheaply as we might want. Which brings me to my one big point with perhaps a couple of consequences. I hope this evening we can debate low carbon at least cost, minimizing the cost of going to low carbon. I believe that leads us to having to think, and we'll hear what Alistair and Angela have to say about this, because they may not like it very much, and they're close to these things. I believe that we need to establish institutionally an energy systems architect for the UK. And I'd like to suggest that we could look at alternative commercial arrangements for the production of wholesale energy, and we can look to North America where they use a rate of return system. And I believe that rate of return system may be worth considering. Let me elaborate just a little on these points. I say low carbon energy at least cost. You know, what's at stake here? Well, if you model the UK energy system, you get some very significantly different outcomes depending on the technology choices that you make. If you make the wrong choices, you can end up spending £40 billion a year more than alternative choices to achieve the same low carbon outcome. £40 billion a year is a phenomenal amount of money unnecessarily spent based on the wrong choices. At a global level, that turns out to be at $2 trillion a year, which is almost an unimaginable number. The technology that seems to be quite significant to these differences is something called carbon capture and storage, which is probably the least loved of all the low carbon technologies, and I'd like to suggest that's a Cinderella that needs to come to the low carbon ball. The idea of an energy systems architect reflects the enormous complexity and the enormous change that needs to go on in our energy system. We have huge peaks and troughs in demand seasonally. Our maximum demand for electricity is after dark, early evening in the winter. In the middle of the night, it's a lot less, and in the middle of summer days, it's far less. So we have to build for that maximum demand. It means we have a huge amount of spare capacity in the middle of summer, and if we want to optimize the costs, we've got to think carefully about how to do that. Heat is another issue. I don't know if you know. In our homes, we tend to use three times as much energy as heat as we do for electricity to run our lights and appliances. An energy systems architect can factor that in and make sure we get that, an optimized way of giving us the energy we need at least cost. An incentivized ROR, I think, would be a solution to avoiding excess profits and super profits. It would be a means of integrating very different kinds of technologies into the network, and I think it would unlock a great deal of investment because it gives a fair and assured return to investors.
Thank you, James. Well, the panelists have given their 2-minute point. I didn't think it was quite fair that Angela got to give a 2-minute point because she's already given 25 of them. So I said to her, what I'd like her to do is, I've never found an English expression for it, l'esprit d'escalier, which is, you all know it. If somebody's insulted you or said something awkward at a dinner party, you shut the door, you go down the stairs, and just then you turn because you remember what was exactly the right word to say. And so I've asked Angela if she would respond based on not just the panelists, but also on the intervening few months since she gave her lecture. Angela.
Well, thank you very much. And only having been told just as we walked in here what l'esprit d'escalier meant, of course, I'm not going to be very helpful in having l'esprit d'escalier. But if I have one thing to say about the lecture in February, and if there's anybody here in this room who was there, it is an apology that I want to give. An apology because actually we were on the platform and it was phenomenally difficult to hear what the questions were from the floor. And so you've got some poor old people, and they were bellowing into the microphone, and we were sort of trying up there on the platform to work it out. And there was one gentleman who actually asked about using holes in the ground, you know, the predominantly North Sea was where he related it, for storage of gas, and if we could use it for carbon capture and storage or whatever. And collectively, up on the platform, none of us knew that that was the question. So I think I answered him something about the price of gas versus oil or something along those lines, completely erroneously. And the gentleman, instead of standing up and saying, you have answered a question that I didn't ask, he told me privately later. So if there's anybody there, you know, it was a cracking question and a really lousy answer. Now, let me just pick up a couple of points, if I may. And I'm going to have a go at the first question, which Neil had a go at, which is, when will there be a workable energy policy? My view is when it's boring again. When you no longer see energy pulsating at you from the headlines and from the television and whatever, and it's quite dull, then I think we've got a workable policy. Because when something is quite dull and we're not talking about it, somehow it's sort of kind of fitting back into the place where we think it should be. So my key aim in this world on energy policy is for energy to be dull. And when we've got it dull, I think we're okay. But I think dull is quite a few years away, and there's plenty of jobs for these gentlemen for quite a few years in helping with getting energy policy right. But one of the Cinderellas, or maybe two Cinderellas around, the first is, can we reduce our demand? Points made certainly by James and by Michael. And secondly, what about carbon capture and storage? I have to say, I think about carbon capture and storage, we'll be saying, what about carbon capture and storage next year and the year after, and in 2020 and 2025 and maybe 2030. And by that time, we'll have built something that is carbon capture and storage and is workable. Only there'll be all sorts of other things about it. So yes, I think it's absolutely right. Maybe we need to get the nanotechnologists on carbon capture and storage. So instead of it being thought of as some vast power station and capturing all the fumes of an industrial area and bunging it down pipes which don't rot from the acidity of it and sending it out in the North Sea and putting it in a well and sealing it off, that somehow we deal with it in a rather more innovative and better way. And I think innovation in some of those areas is going to be far more important to us than having an electric car or a hydrogen car, even though those things are coming along. But energy reducing demand is actually quite a conundrum, because on the one hand it's absolutely correct. You know, if we could stop using quite as much gas and electricity as we do, then we wouldn't need to build a whole lot more, and for us personally, we'd be paying less. I mean, I, for example, do not know why we are sitting in this lecture theatre this evening with all the lights on. If we switched half the lights off, I'm sure we'd still be able to see you, and you'd probably be able to see us. In fact, we could actually do this in the dark. I'm not really proposing that. And yesterday, I went down to Ofgem, the regulator. I go in and out of Ofgem probably about 8 times every 4 days, or that's what it feels like. And we sat in this beautifully air-conditioned room. In fact, it was so chilly that we really wanted to open the doors or the windows to warm it up. I mean, there is a whole lot that we could actually do about using our energy rather better. But it's in one of these areas that I think we confuse the issue by using the word energy. Because in this country, about 3/4 of the gas is used by households to heat their house and about 1/4 used by industry. About 3/4 of electricity is used by industry and 1/4 by households. Now that starts to sort of get a handle on, if electricity consumption goes down, is it predominantly households or is it industry? And I think that one of the main reasons that we did reduce our electricity consumption is, of course, tied up with the recession. But the other thing about it is, of course, most of the policy costs sit on electricity, not on gas. So if I'm going to give you free insulation in your house through the energy company obligation, it's got to sit on the electricity bill. That's the way the system operates. So I am not surprised that industry, faced with a carbon price floor which was rising, which means the wholesale cost of electricity is rising, said, hang on, chaps, what about us? Because they were seeing this potentially continuing increase in the cost of electricity. And so sometimes we need to separate out gas and electricity, and the more we conflate it with energy, the more we can make a monumental pig's breakfast of our policy. I mean, if people are going to reduce their energy consumption, number one, their house needs to be insulated better. Number two, they need to have some way of, if I may say, the wives, when they've gone off to work, be able to switch on the dishwasher and the washing machine when they've gone to work on their app at a time when the price of electricity is cheaper. We can do lots of things about managing this stuff, about how we use our consumption. And whilst I'm a huge fan of smart meters, what a shame it was designed by a bunch of blokes, because they spent all their time concentrating on the kit. So we've got this piece of kit called a smart meter. By the way, it doesn't actually fit in your kitchen cabinet. They didn't think of that, because being blokes, they thought a nice bit of kit, have it on the wall, I can smile at it every time I come in from work. And do you know what the second thing they did? The second thing is they said, and you've got to have your little device where you can see what's happening in the kitchen. Why? Because the little woman's in the kitchen all day. What a load of rubbish. And then they put it all into law. They put it all into legislation. So here is one of the things which will really enable us to use some of our energy a bit more wisely, use our electricity more wisely or more remotely. And it's the concentration has been a nice bit of kit that doesn't fit and a device that's got to sit in the kitchen instead of an app that comes to work with you. Should I get off my high horse? I think I will. I am a huge believer in what Alistair has said. Clarity of rules, clear policies, ones that people understand, bring the population with us, and then you can get your energy policy in place. But if you duck and weave on the policy all the time, if you haven't told people the truth, if the rules keep moving, if we end up just picking up a piece of something that isn't liked and pick that bit, then we end up continuously in this debate about energy instead of getting to a sensible solution which people can afford, which we've worked out what we're going to do and have done a timetable where it's achievable. Is that my doodah?
Yes,
Esprit d'escalier.
I'm never insulting you at a dinner party, though, because it will take you ages to get down the stairs. But anyway, welcome for that. What I'd like to do is to now start to hand over so that you can get on your high horses as well. You'll have noticed one, I think, very interesting thing in terms of a misnaming of both the lecture and the debate. We have two emotive words in there, power and energy, but I think we were missing the emotive word money, which is, I think, every one of the panelists has raised. And I love a quote that Earl Warren made, Ben Franklin may have discovered electricity, but it's the man who invented the meter who made the money. So I think Angela's absolutely right to focus on things like smart meters. Right. Well, what are the rules? Well, there are very few rules, but I just want to point out that the panelists have given their CVs. I'd like to turn to you in groups during each of these 15-minute segments. You're welcome to identify yourself in any affiliation, but the panelists have given their CVs, so we don't need your life stories as well. Short comments and questions, please. Now, I'm going to pick on a few people because they were nice enough to email in some questions, which I thought was absolutely delightful. And we also have some students here today who've been primed so that we see that all the rules and regulations and taxes and national debt that we incur in our new energy system, they'll see where it came from and what they're going to pay in the future. So if I could, please, I'd like to pick on, in the most gentle fashion, Isha Patel from City of London School for Girls. Are you lying out there somewhere, Isha? Yes. Go ahead. Your question or comment. Hold on, we've got the microphone. Sorry there, Peter.
I want to look at this from a philosophical point of view and say, how is this a manipulation of power? How does it show in the world we live in? How does it look at it from a different point of view? And how can we consider energy as a resource and something that we distribute for equality and justice, tying into like democracy and current ideas?
Thank you, Isha. Oliver from Westminster, where are you lurking? Hands up, thanks. Great.
Hello, hi. Coming from reading through the lecture on my way here, I came up with the question, how free is the free market the lecture calls for, if it also calls for government intervention through a strike price for some energy sectors, if that strike price is a distortion of the free market? Are those two not contradictions in themselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Actually, Oliver, you remind me of something I wanted to ask. Could I have a show of hands from everybody who was there on the 27th of February? And everybody who was listening? Oh, same. Oh, there. Sorry about that. And can I have a show of hands? Everybody who was there on the 27th of February, and everybody who's read the lecture. Okay, so we can take it as pretty much read. So I think that's a great thing, everyone. Thank you. Could I now ask Tiffany from Christ Hospital? Could you show your hand there? There she is. Peter?
Hi, I'm Tiffany. So I have a question. What are some possible ways to increase the incentive in the renewable energy market and the innovation of renewable energy technology?
Thank you. And then Hugh Parnell, I saw you there a minute ago. He was here in the middle, Peter.
I probably don't need a microphone. People can hear me, they don't need me. So I'm Hugh Parnell, I come from Cambridge, and I run a thing called Cambridge Cleantech. And unfortunately, the panel have stolen all of my best questions, so I'm going to have to conflate two or three. You have indeed answered most of what I was going to ask, but I think the two most important things I was interested in your views on were the role of imports, because after all, we've talked a little bit about electricity and gas as if it was purely a UK issue. We already import most of our gas and about 6% of our power, so the role of imports is a question. And I would really like to stress the role of innovation as a very large plank in the policy discussion, because while each of you have mentioned it, we don't seem to have acknowledged that actually the UK is full of innovation. We have some extraordinarily clever people, not least in Cambridge, but elsewhere as well, doing good things with demand reduction and alternative supply and grid and meters, etc. So I just want to stress that and see if you can respond to why we aren't hearing more about how we use it.
Brains outside the circle line. Well, we'll never know. Margaret Doherty, where are you lurking there? Margaret? Oh, there we go.
Hi, Margaret Doherty from the Environment Agency. Should there be an obligation of security of supply upon the power companies?
Thank you. I think that's a good flavor for the panelists. Neil, I was wondering if I could turn to you to just give some quick feedback on that before we move on. With just a reminder that what we're trying to address is this energy trilemma that Angela spoke about. How do we provide supply, meet these targets, and control price? And does that involve innovation? Does it involve policies? Does it involve subsidies? Where do we look?
Okay, I mean, unashamed plug for AMP, my business. We are actually doing a capital raise in the market right now. And so we are trying to bring capital to bear to try and install some types of renewable energy. And it's interesting to see the reaction we get from capital markets. I think more than over-subsidising and over-incentivising, the real request from markets is please give us stability. I think it's going to be a recurring theme across the panel. People just want to know where they stand. And when sectors innovate, the cost of capital comes down over time. So initially, the feed-in tariff on solar, which I don't think is the most helpful form of energy that can be produced, it was excessive, and the project returns were very high. It was being financed on returns of 13, 14%. The feed-in tariff got cut, which as a taxpayer I thought was a good thing. And guess what? People are now developing solar projects on yields of 5 and 6. The subsidy stimulated the market, but actually there's plenty of money still going into that sector. So for me, on the subject of incentivisation, the real way to get things done is to reduce the cost of capital and also increase access to capital markets through confidence. I don't think politicians particularly help with the confidence that exists in capital markets. I've already spoken about imports, and in my own little utopian world, I would just love to see, in other sectors we have seen technologies get smaller and more powerful. My mobile phone now replaces the function of a stereo system, a camera, a cinema, a calculator, a computer. It's also, but with power we still have a grid, and we have centralized generation, and people always go for very, very large scale solutions. And so a part of me says, how do you eat an elephant? Well, in bite-sized chunks. And I hope that as technologies get brought to bear, and people invest in these businesses and execute on projects, then slowly we will be able to solve A, the problem of imports, and B, the reliance on these huge sort of almost monopolistic type businesses. So for me it's about distributed energy, small scale, and bringing capital to bear.
Neil, just two supplementary quick questions. Firstly, how are you finding the fundraising? And secondly, Alistair opened with a point about really clarity on the rules and simplicity. The people are looking at investing in you. Are those the concerns that they raise as well?
Yeah, there have been some fund managers I go and see say, oh, I've just been to a conference and heard such and such a politician talking, and I'm a bit jaundiced about the sector right now. And you have to do a lot of work. But ironically, as we saw yields and the cost of capital come down in solar, we saw the asset value of the underlying projects going up. So people think that a reduction in subsidy is everyone's worst nightmare. Well, if you get enough stuff in the ground early on, you can make a lot of money as those subsidies. And government should be more transparent. I just think their strategy is to put money to stimulate activity in a place, and then when that activity occurs, to start to pull it back. And if I'm the Treasury or a taxpayer, I think, that's good. And that policy is being repeated, and they are constantly interfering with subsidies. And you say, well, great, you're in business, you've got to put up with it and plan for it. So that's the way we tackle investors there. Renewables has got a bit of a difficult sentiment in financial markets. Renewables isn't great. There's things like the DRAC situation. Sometimes there's political risk. Everyone remembers when Spain retrospectively pulled some tariffs on solar. In the UK, once you are in the ground and accredited, it's a 20-year deal, and we have complete confidence that that won't change because it'll destroy the PFI sector and various other things. So, I mean, sentiment market, it's some and some. We are getting a very good reception. There's one or two fund managers I recognise sitting in the room. Anybody else that's interested in talking to us afterward, the more the merrier. We just want to get capital and apply our capital to put projects in the ground.
World Traders, we take advertising. James, just a quick question, and then I'd like you to also have your opportunity to respond to the audience. But just briefly, are you helping the market or are you queering it? Are you making it more or less stable for people like Neil?
Well, I suppose I made the suggestion because I believed that I was making it sort of better for the consumer and better for the investor as well. I note the question from Oliver about is you got a free market when someone's setting a strike price. And I think it's a very good point. And of course, what we've got is a period of subsidies at the moment while we're trying to work out which are the best of the low carbon technologies that are available. And we better admit it, the strike price is a subsidized price. And what we need to get is to into a position where we're putting the market to work in a much better way than we are during this phase. But we also need to be careful, I think, about understanding the nature of this market and not assuming all markets are the same. So I'd like to see major companies bidding against each other for the right to generate power and taking on risks. I'd like a proper understanding of the risks that companies can take and should take on the basis of their performance, and risks that they are unable to take, and how those risks may be allocated elsewhere. Ultimately, the customer has to take them. But I think my suggestion of a rate of return system enables companies to bid in on the basis of a rate of return that they would find satisfactory for an investment they might make, but subject to their performance. And to me, it's not abandoning the market, it's actually putting the market to work in the right way for this sector. That was an
James,
attempt to answer yours.
could you take 45 seconds and just explain quickly your rate of return argument so the audience understand it?
Well, what you do is you say to companies that we need a certain amount of generating capacity, and my systems architect is going to have to decide what generating capacity we think is appropriate, because I believe there is a range of technologies that are going to be required in order to achieve energy security on one hand and low carbon on the other. And as we learn more and more about those things, then we'll be able to put more and more money to the best and least cost technologies. But what you say to companies is, I need 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. I need 5 gigawatts of nuclear. I want 5 gigawatts of CCS-based power. And Angela, I'd like to talk to you a bit more about CCS, because if we're still talking about 2030, we don't fix climate change. And then you invite bids. And what companies come and say was, I believe at these capital costs and these operating costs, I can deliver that, and I want this rate of return. And you match the bids, and the way that you do it is looking at, so what's the lowest NPV ultimately to the consumer? Now, there will be, I'm not suggesting there's any perfect system, of course, and you can immediately think of potential objections to that, that in some sense it's a cost-plus system. Well, it isn't if it's properly bid and properly incentivized. And you put the requirements on the energy companies, as I say, that they can carry. So the fact that they can build on time and to budget, the fact they can operate the plant to the cost that they say and operate it effectively, you impose the risks on them. If you're in a period where you've got a combination of base load power, load following power, intermittent power like solar, what doesn't work after dark, and the wind that may not be blowing in the deep cold times of winter, there's a very uncertain investment outlook for companies who are thinking of investing in any of those. So do I get offtake? So there's something called the offtake risk. If I've got a plant that can produce electricity, will I be allowed to do so? And you may choose not to impose that offtake risk on the supplier in certain circumstances. And then you get an investor that's more able to invest. I think actually the ROR begins to look a lot more like a government bond. Insurance companies and pension funds invest in government bonds. And if you can offer that sort of commercial arrangement, I believe you can unlock a huge amount of investment, because it's pretty clear that the balance sheets of the generators do not support the 100 billion, 200 billion that we need to invest, and we need to unlock very substantial sources of funds.
Thank you very much for that, James. But before you get to chat to Angela about CCS, I want to get in on fusion, which I think has been around for another 60 years as well.
Well, don't compare the two.
Alistair.
I need to chat to you about CCS as well.
I'll just be brief on innovation and come at it from the network point of view. Fundamentally, from about 1990 through to 2010, the industry was running under a price control called RPI minus X. Just think about a lemon and keep squeezing it. That's what RPI minus X is. So we drove a lot of engineers, we drove all ideas, most innovation out of the sector over 20 years. Very successful in saving costs and getting returns and getting a new culture of discipline into the sector. Absolutely lousy in terms of developing innovation in networks, which are a critical part of both smart grid future, but also security of supply. One of the things I was perhaps more pleased about when I was at Ofgem was the creation of the Low Carbon Network Fund. Relatively controversial because customers are directly funding R&D. And so far, in just 2 years of this scheme, 3 years, £200 million has been invested. The rules are very simple, which is whoever gets the money has to share the output and the outcomes. But fundamentally, it's a wide net for those who wish to get involved in R&D, in networks, voltage control, local generation, etc. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that the network businesses are becoming politicized. And as the network charge becomes politicized, and though it's not just supply, just read the newspapers, you can see what Centrica is talking about openly in the newspapers. As the networks become politicized, will there be a question mark about whether this is a good use of public funds, customers' funds? I really hope we don't get there, but look out for the 1st of July and the 9th of July, because the Select Committee is looking at networks on those 2 days.
Michael?
I got the question at the beginning about, was it energy distribution for social equality? What was exactly the point you were making? How it could be used? Well, right now we have a global problem of about 1 in 7 people in the world not having any access to electricity, and even more so refrigeration and other things that we consider essential. Within the context of the UK, there is also inequality. There's the famous fuel poverty, and so on and so forth. There are ways in which we can, I think, in which the energy markets can help. The problem is that you either have to choose whether it's going to come out of the budget, so we pay in any way indirectly, or whether you're going to do it by gradating, if you like, the price of electricity, which you could do, but again, you're going to have people who say, well, we want one electricity no matter how we consume. So it is a matter of cross-subsidizing, if you like, the various social groups. On a worldwide scale, I think it is even a bigger problem because in order to give electricity and energy in general to all these over 1 billion people right now, not everybody is going to necessarily follow the low carbon path. They want to give access, improve conditions of life, etc. In countries where the immediate choice, if you like, of fuel to produce that electricity is actually fossil fuel. So we have an even more urgent, if you like, problem there. And if you take into account that most predictions look at about an extra 2 to 2.5 billion people by 2050, a lot of these people are going to be in these areas which are already energy poor. So it's a huge, huge social problem.
Thank you.
I'll pick up a couple of points, if I may, to Oliver. I think you asked a question about the free market. The market is not free. This is not a free market in energy, nor will it be. I don't know whether it ever will be, because energy is considered to be right. It's fundamental for the economy. In many countries, there is a very strong state involvement. But certainly at the moment when we are transitioning from a traditional way in which we generated electricity from coal and with some gas and some nuclear to a far more low carbon situation, in that transition period we will always see some more state intervention and more subsidies if we're ever going to get there. I think one of the biggest questions on the state intervention is this, is the electricity market reform, which is the legislation that has recently gone through Parliament, has lots of areas in which the Secretary of State is allowed to intervene. And I think the question will be one of how much intervention actually does take place, because certainly one of the slightly more philosophical debates that never took place at the start was the more state, less state argument, and there are still some very big divisions about that. To Tiffany, who asked about increasing incentives in renewable energy market, I think that's it's a good question. To my mind, sometimes the incentives are in the wrong place. At the moment, we're having a tendency to incentivize a bit like we used to incentivize the Common Agricultural Policy. So you incentivized on production, and that gave you wine lakes and butter mountains and all the rest. And there's an element of that certainly in the way that subsidies are actually acting at the moment. And there's sort of programs underway which are all about integration, which means renewables have to sort of, take their better place. But I think I would prefer, if it is possible, to use the incentives that there are available somewhere in the investment piece and somewhere in the development piece to bring the actual capital cost, the investment, more into line rather than incentivize on output. And the question of which we moved into, which was what about using a rate of return method for the whole way in which you calculate and assess how much with a systems architect over the top. Do you know, there's a bit of that that's coming along really in an odd sort of way. As we move to contracts for difference, which are bidded for, as we get an auction system for the capacity mechanism, and you've got the grid, that part of the grid which is going to be called the service operator that sits over the top and sort of assesses and decides, we kind of are moving a bit in that direction. Now, I don't think we've got anything like as far as you're proposing, but I think there's something there, James, I think, which sort of says that we're on the way, and that might well be a very useful way to go. Let's see, because standing still, I don't think is an option. And by the way, on carbon capture and storage, I was trying to be realistic rather than just sort of criticising in any other way. Imports, innovation, are we worried about imports? I think we do have some very significant amount of imports. We operate in a very, we are a natural trading nation, and we import certainly our gas from some fairly strange parts of the world. What should we be doing about it? And well, I do think it seems to me very strange for us to be, have a potential raw material under our feet, but instead of looking to see how we can sensibly use it, we're prepared to carry on importing from some very odd parts of the world. Obligation, can I just do that? Should there be an obligation on the suppliers, on the power companies for security of supply? The answer to that is no. And the reason it's no is because this, this area is one in which those decisions are, have been put in place to be decided by a mixture of grid, of, on behalf, if you like, of other authorities, by the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and indeed from the regulator itself. My worry is that we must not end up in the same sort of tripartite that we had in the financial services industry as we came towards the banking crisis, where it was a bit after you claw, after you settle. And they say you've got the Bank of England, you've got the Treasury, and you've got the FSA, and nobody at that point could quite decide whose responsibility it was to actually step in and do something. Now, I think that we need to think about the tripartite of grid, DEC, and Ofgem, particularly in the aspect of security of supply. You can't park everything on the power companies. But at the same time, one thing that worries me is there's far too many people who have a locus in the whole area of energy. So if you take the Environment Agency as an example, the Environment Agency can quite reasonably restrict, for example, the water extraction license that a power station needs for the purposes of cooling. It can and does require a certain amount of, or increasing amount of protection, so you don't draw eels into your cooling system. This is about protecting the eel, not the cooling system. And there's other things as well. The Department of DCLG decides on the rates. And yet you can have things, you can have these entities outside the policy making of energy and climate change, which actually impact on the industry. Get everything together. Put your committee together. Get your groups. That's what I take a long time.
Alistair.
That's all right. I mean, partly
coordinate.
To answer Angela and also the question, I always remember in 2003, I'd been in America and then been in Europe, so I've been away from Britain for a little while. And I was focusing back on UK energy issues. And within my first few days at Ofgem, I was with both my lawyer and my PR advisor. And they said, well, you do realise you have joint responsibility for security of supply. I fell off the chair. I said, I'm sorry, I'm the regulator. No, they said, no, you do. It's in the Utilities Act. And the lawyer said, well, tough, it's with you. The PR advisor said, well, you know who we're joint with? The government. They said, yeah, well, that means you take all the blame. Yeah. So I thought this is good. But obligation and markets are not natural bedfellows. Nevertheless, frankly, that phrase was designed when we thought we had a free market, but we don't. So this relationship that Angela talks about between grid, Ofgem and government is very important. And grid, I think if they're here today, and if they are, I'd love to hear from them, would be passionate about saying that they do not have the obligation. Some of you in this audience might be equally passionate to say, well, you should, because you're the system operator. But that's a debate for another day. The important thing I want to leave you with is that there is a memorandum of understanding. We created one in the light of the financial crisis, and there is a way of operating during a crisis. And I hope and expect that the current incumbents at Ofgem work within that. Just one thing to look forward to over the next 6 months. Should Scotland go independent, then it is worth looking out for a report called the Armour Commission report that is due out imminently to see where they put the obligation for supply in Scotland. It could be very leading.
Thank you very much for that. Great. Well, I'm going to draw to a close the trilemma with a few comments and a few questions for the audience. I think Michael reminded us that there are still people out there who have no energy whatsoever, and in preparing for this, there was a lovely bit from Bill Bryson. He said, did we forget just how painfully dim the world was before electricity? A candle, a good candle, provides barely 1/100th of the illumination of a single 100-watt bulb. And I think we often forget it in the same way we forget where milk comes from and eggs and all sorts of other things. It's very difficult. Well, on the are we half dim or half bright, I'd like to ask you, the panel have obviously outlined, and you've outlined some of the questions about this trilemma. Can we meet supply? Can we meet our carbon targets? And can we control price? I'd like a hands up amongst the bright optimists among you who think this is a solvable problem. Yeah, good. Interesting. But interesting, the audience seems to be quite split on that. Right, well, we're going to turn to the second element, which is generation and competition. I think we've touched a little bit on some of this. And I'm also going to open this up for some... Yes?
Did I behave badly and just intrude? that question you asked, do you think will solve it? I was interested in the answer. I'd be interested to know whether people think it's the problems are lack of technology or lack of political will.
Okay. Hands up those who think it's a lack of technology. And hands up those who think it's a lack of political will.
Isn't that interesting?
Wow. Yeah.
So we've all
Thank
got
you,
ourselves
James.
to blame.
Thank you very much. Well, there we go. Well, at least we're on target for the debate, which is very much about policy. I'd like to call, if I could, please, on Eric Tracy. Eric, you had a couple of questions. I think Angela was right early on. If we turned the lights out, I could find people more quickly.
I can remember one of them anyway. It's probably a bit cheeky. The big six energy companies are in the paper every day, including today, being pilloried for being bad guys, and I don't sort of enjoy that. But then I kind of think these are the people who've got all of the information, all of it, between them, and they're big enough and resourceful enough to have all of the very, very best powers of communication and dissemination of information. And there's still a problem? Where does that leave me? Is it because actually they're really not very good at communicating, or they don't know what the information is, or there is something there to be worried about? It's just curious.
Thank you. Bob Middleton on competition. Bob is down here. Bob, you had a very challenging question for the panel.
Thank you. Bob Middleton. I'm in the energy business for 40 years, 25 years of which have been offshore. And I note that there is a 5% planning margin involved in unrest and difficult times that people have in energy markets. My question, therefore, relates to the tension between market mechanisms, economic interests, and environmental controls, which often result in contradictory or counterintuitive outcomes. I'll just give you two examples. Coca-Cola is one of the largest companies in the world, having built its business selling a mildly toxic drink in a seemingly unconstrained free market economy. Motor car manufacturers are able to sell vehicles in the UK which travel at more than 70 miles an hour, despite this being the maximum permissible speed on UK roads. Does the panel believe that the Chinese concept of socialist market economy offers an alternative means of controlling environmentally damaging activity with a framework of social awareness and marketing restraint?
That's a very challenging argument. I will definitely not buy a Tesla because it exceeds 70 miles an hour. Robert Woodthorpe Brown. There we go.
Michael, I'm not sure which of the two questions I asked.
You had a very interesting question, well, both of them actually, one on labor and energy prices, which I think is relevant to this, and the second on interconnectivity of European grids.
Yeah, well, I remember at Chatham House recently, we had the director of the International Energy Authority came. He talked all about the fact there's nothing you could do to get the prices down until I asked him what would happen if there was total interconnectivity in Europe. The figure was 25 to 30% reduction in prices. So why aren't we doing it? And this is coming, of course, that's political will. The other one was the issue that I wanted to raise was the fact of instead of having grids all the time, we should be having much more production of electricity, especially linked to heavy users of energy. We have a big problem in this country that we're not going to be competitive against the States when they have the shale gas, because our electricity is much more expensive than theirs. Therefore, we have to have cheaper energy produced right next door to the energies concerned. Therefore, why are we now opting in this country for an extremely expensive old-fashioned technology for nuclear when we could be using molten sodium reactors, which could be used on a smaller industry basis? Technology exists since the 50s in the States.
Okay. Panelists, burning to put your hands up?
To Bob's question, I could give it a go. And I think you were saying, should we use we look at what happens in China and how they run things and what we do here and whether we should be doing something different, and also consumer behavior, I think you were talking about. But I think the great thing about the Chinese is they're systems thinkers, of course, and they do have a political system that seems to enable them, at least for now, to be able to implement the effects of that system's thinking. I also think they're very taken by markets and the efficiency that markets can drive. So I'm not so sure that we're going to be completely different from what happens with us and what happens in China. I think in both cases we have to put the market to work as much as we possibly can. By the way, I don't want to take too much of an excursion, but it makes me think of what Aisha was asking about, the philosophical points. We need to do a deal with China and North America and Europe in order to avoid climate change. And I suspect when we do the deal, we're going to have to put the same mechanisms to work in order to deal with it. As for consumers and our behavior and the fact that we seem to need to drive cars that can go at twice the speed limit, I think that's who we are. And one of the questions about whether we can do this or not, I was talking about we need to treble the energy efficiency of economies. I'm sure we can make cars much more efficient than they are, and we already have done so. I'm sure we can make TVs, appliances, industrial processes to some degree much more efficient as they are. Whether we can stop ourselves consuming energy, whether we as individuals will not want to spend that dividend of improved efficiency by consuming more, I think that's something we've got to recognize. I think we'll vote for governments that'll help us have more and keep out of our way. If we want to fix climate change, we need governments that will get in our way and cause us to consume less. I think that's a very difficult political challenge. And therefore, in my thinking about how we have to deal with this, I do think I'm putting the accent more on decarbonizing the energy supply than being very, very confident that people are going to consume less, although we do need to think about sustainability, and we do need to do as much as we can in that area.
Thank you. Alistair?
Yeah, I'm trying to, your first question is wonderfully simple, but incredibly complex, and I'm going to need some diplomacy to try and answer it, and I'll probably fail on the latter. But if I start with a story, I always remember, probably around 2008, a chairman of one of the big six who had never been into Ofgem before. In fact, the chief executive barely came into Ofgem, stormed into my office, nearly took the door off its hinges, and basically said he was scandalised to even be in the regulator's office, to even be in Millbank, that he was a company operating in free markets. I said, well, that's very well, but your product's rubbish and you're undermining consumer confidence and public confidence in what you're doing. So what are you going to do? And in a way, that story epitomises the fact that the macro picture of price increases, really profound. If you remember, in the early part of the last decade, gas prices went from 60 pence a therm down to 12, which of course saw off British Energy as a company, but then rebounded up towards 60. And really, we've just been reacting to that very high gas price and losing our own indigenous gas, moving on to global fuel markets, because the wholesale charge is 50 to 60% of the bill. And I think the companies ultimately were slow to see the link of price to public perception. So from their point of view, and I'm not being critical, it's very difficult for them to understand that. They went from thinking that they were in an unfettered market to an environment where price was becoming an issue. But the other critical issue is that when the government started issuing targets for greenhouse gases, targets for renewables, targets for fuel poverty, targets actually don't work with markets. And again, it was inevitable that the sector was becoming politicised and that there was a public debate going on. And I think the companies perhaps were slow to that. I think the companies also felt constrained by competition law. They were very worried about giving any sense of a unified voice, because that might look as if they've been talking to each other. So that's on their side. Generically, on price increases, the academic community, particularly those on the Austrian school, would say you can't talk about prices even if you can see that they're going to go up, because that will create prices going up. So that was still a lagging philosophy within the sector. And then, believe me, if you said to the politicians, I think prices are on their way up, just look at the forward price curve for gas, you were basically thrown out the office. Politically, it just became a very, very difficult issue. And as it became an issue for the household budget, it became an issue for the politician. And consequently, I think it's a great question, because there's probably an academic course here that you can develop to see how communication is so very important to a sector like this. And I think, Angela, I'll spare her blushes, but Angela's arrival, 12, 18 months ago, was more or less like the cavalry arriving, but I suspect you didn't find very much because so much just hadn't occurred in the space. I mean, I don't know if that's a lead into you. But I'm not trying to criticise people. It's a very, very difficult 10-year period.
Make it a lead-in, but can we keep to a minute or so?
Yes, of course. The reason why you read the newspapers and Big Six, as you say, were on the front of them, is because the question is, if the wholesale markets have gone down, prices have gone down, why haven't you, companies, put down your prices? And the answer is because what they've done is they've bought long ahead in order to keep prices fixed for their customers, because they're faced with the potential of a price freeze post the next general election. And up until the question was asked about the wholesale market price going down, all the pressure was, will you please not put your prices up? Will you please keep your prices steady? So you're absolutely right. You can't do anything correct. How did they get into the difficulty when they're always pilloried? Well, Alistair's given you a very good lead-in. Could I just add to that? Because customer service was not particularly good. They were too detached from their customers. They didn't explain enough because they were in the business of generating, and they thought all the rest of it, their attention was elsewhere. We are now in a situation in which the energy has become a very tough, fought-over policy, as most of those who create energy policy don't want to say actually what policy is about is by building new stuff, and it's expensive stuff, and by the way, you're going to pay for it, all as part of the very real and necessary saving carbon, as they don't want to say that. If you've got somebody who people don't really like in the room, you say it's all their fault. And of course, we all look for somebody to blame. You should be worried because it's an extraordinarily difficult bind that we're in. We actually don't need just 6 companies, we need a lot more companies. And at the moment, people are saying, crikey, why should I be in this market? Because all I'm going to be is hated. Do you want me to have a go at a couple of the others?
No.
You don't? Oh, what a shame. What a shame. If anybody wants to ask me...
Go on.
No.
Just be quick.
Right, I'll take offence then. Very, very, very quickly then. Should we have a Chinese socialist market economy? At the moment, I say to you, the transition is more or less, that's what it is. And the reason the Chinese market works well is because you've got this odd combination of a communist dictatorship ruling a population of sort of natural entrepreneurs, which is rather odd. But actually, that's where we're going. Whether we like it or not, that's what the transition is about. And on the question of would you get prices down if we interconnect everywhere, I forget who it was that asked that right across Europe. The answer is, on the one hand, you would get a reduction in prices. On the other hand, you get a huge increase in the security of supply risk, because what comes in can go out. So the economic analysis I have never yet seen is the point at which interconnection goes from being a good to being a risk. And so before one puts one's eggs all the way in one basket, you've actually got to do those analyses. I was quick.
Right. I love the question about distributed energy and building facilities next door to large-scale industrial consumers. We get paid 5.2p for exporting our electricity to the grid, and you guys are paying 12p per kilowatt hour at home. And the idea of being able to build a little facility next door to a factory and sell it over the fence for 8p and split the difference is really, really very attractive. So roll on distributed energy. I love the Coca-Cola question as well. I've never been able to work out why someone will pay 5 times as much for certain types of fizzy water than they will for a pint of milk. And with power, I find it is so fundamental and so vital. And in terms of ethics, years ago, a fund manager, a friend of mine, said, because we were always seeing ethical investment funds when we were building our carbon business, he said, Neil, I've been studying this. I want to launch an unethical investment fund. Because everything I look at, gambling, alcohol, businesses that exploit children, arms manufacture, pornography, you can keep going. The return on capital for those nasty businesses is brilliant. The second that someone's supplying something that we all desperately need, we moan about the price. How much would you, if there's a power cut, how much would you all pay to stop your freezer contents melting? You want the lights on. So at some point, people need to cherish and support the companies that are trying to supply us something that's so important.
Just a brief one on distributed energy. I totally agree. And if we look at the model that Denmark is following, they've taken it a step further and they're moving into a lot more distributed heat for households, for whole areas. So I think it's a brilliant model. And Denmark is a market worth looking at because although it's a tenth of the size of the UK, they have the same problems. They have very few resources in terms of fossil fuels. They rely very much on the fossil fuels they have. They want to phase out by 2030 to be 100% renewable. So they have set some very interesting targets. I would say one thing, their electricity is expensive, is among the most expensive in Europe, including Germany, and probably about 80% more expensive than the UK, which brings us back to the tough choices that as consumers we have to make. So we have to take some sort of responsibility along the way, either reduce what we do, what we consume, or be prepared to pay higher, at least in the medium term, which of course is tough in this economic climate. And as for the Chinese model, interesting, it makes things work. It puts in place a big infrastructure project. It leaves a lot of ethical problems behind it. So, you know, if you see the big picture, the Three Gorges Dam was excellent because it's a lot of renewable electricity, but it did displace 1 million people. Now it depends what you value most and how likely, you know, one way or another, we're in a country where the government is judged and can be removed. There it cannot be removed, so they have much lower risk. Plus, they don't always necessarily getting it right, given that they're all choking and they're putting masks in order to walk around in their big city. So is that necessarily good? I'm not entirely sure.
Well, with 15 minutes to go, where do we stand? We seem to have a bunch of technology optimists and policy pessimists. The panel, I think, have been very helpful in kind of proving that this may be a gut reaction, but it may be absolutely correct. What I'd like to do in the remaining time is to get a few more audience comments or questions, quite pithy ones. But I'd like, I think, to focus very much on, can the UK deliver? Spike Milligan once quipped, God said, let there be light, and there was light, but the electricity board said he'd have to wait till Thursday to get connected. And I think that's what summarizes where you all seem to sit at the moment, which is along the lines that we can do it, but we don't seem to be able to get our act together in this jigsaw. So I'd like some short, pithy comments from you on, can the UK deliver? Perhaps some questions about Scotland or the EU. Hands, please. I'll start up there, top left. Is that Sarah? Sarah Leonard?
Just on your question there, I'm a geography teacher, and I've noticed in the time that I've been teaching this topic that just as soon as a textbook's printed with the target that we're trying to achieve, it's changed. And when I was speaking to some of my pupils about it, one of their big questions is, what is a reasonable target? We've had 10% by 2010, it's 20% by 2015. These figures keep changing. And so my question is, what is a reasonable target? And are we ever going to get one in a political system which risks change the whole time? That's my question.
Thank you. Show of hands here.
Thank you, Edward Sankey, Worshipful Company of Management Consultants. There's a heck of a lot of risk around at the moment. Shale gas might come in and change the supply for power stations, geopolitical risk, which we're very much aware of now, political regulatory risk, maybe an emerging risk of reduced linkage being permitted between generation and distribution, a whole lot. So I'd be interested to know how much in the cost of capital for new projects these days there's a risk premium compared to an underlying risk-free rate of interest. And if it is large, then does that mean we should be much more encouraging to those people with more money than opportunities, such as the Chinese and the sovereign wealth funds? Should we be turning to them much more and asking them and inviting them to invest in major projects if the major power companies and energy companies won't do so?
Thank you, Edward. Hands here in the middle of the audience, anyone? No burning? Gentleman up front.
Okay.
Cambridge has got his hand up.
Could I just ask something about the role of government? I mean, I don't work in energy. I've worked for a long time in education. And it's probably true that most government interventions in education over the last 50-odd years have either been ineffectual, which is probably a good thing, or disastrous. And I don't hear very clearly what the role of the government is in energy. I don't hear anybody explaining what the roles of all the parties are. And if government isn't doing that, I don't see who is going to. How can we get government to accept that it has an important role in this, which is more than just saying, we'll get your energy bills down?
Okay. Gentleman up there, and I think I'll close it at that. So, Peter, yeah.
My name is Amit Oza from Palmetto Energy. The question was, can the UK deliver? And I'd like to add a question to that and to bring in Europe. And my question is, can the UK deliver? And if that would be in spite of Europe or with the help of European policy?
Thank you. Peter, behind you.
Simon Maddox, Worshipful Company of World Traders. My company is involved in managing the supply chain for wood chip shipments from Ontario and Canada to Europe to be burnt as a substitute for coal. What is the panel's estimate of the probability of still being in business doing the same thing in 20 years, given the expectation that the subsidy on which our initial contract is based is going to diminish over time, as a comment was made before?
So a real sustainability question. Excellent. Okay. Panelists, we have about 6 minutes, and you've worked that out. That's about a minute each. So I'd like you, if you could, address the questions, and perhaps if you could wrap up any concluding thought that you have. Michael, can I start with you, if that's not too rude? No?
Just throw somebody else.
I'll start on the other end then. Fair enough. Well done. James.
Well, I wonder if I can pick up Sarah's question and the question from the gentleman at the bottom. I don't think you said your name, but anyway, you've been in education for a long time. And about targets, and to the UK government's credit, I mean, we have set a target. We've put it in legislation, and we said we want to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. And that seems to me to be the right sort of target to set. And going back to Michael's opening remarks, if we're to deliver on beating climate change, that's the sort of thing that a country like the UK needs to do. And going back to the earlier point, I'm glad to hear it, we all seem to agree the technology exists to get the job done. We also need some interim targets, and the Committee on Climate Change says, okay, if that's what we need to do by 2050, here's how we're going to have to get the curve going, and we're going to stop the emissions rising, and then we've got to bring them down. I worry a bit about over-targeting things. So if someone says that means we need 30% of our energy from renewables by 2020, I say, why is that then? Because surely what we want to do is to do this at minimum cost. Now, if we want to give renewables a stimulus, we should give them an early stimulus. But I think we've got to be a little bit careful of equating renewables as the only low-carbon energy is renewable energy, going back to carbon capture and storage. So I think it's right that we've got targets, but those are the targets that we should have. They are long-term. There's a risk of saying it's so long in the future we don't care, but that's why we need these shorter-term targets for the sort of profile of carbon emissions. And actually, I think the UK is doing better than many other governments around the world, and I think probably does better on its own than with Europe to that question. To your point about the role of government, and back to what Angela was saying earlier, and I said this to him, Ed Davey is the systems architect at the moment. The Energy Act made Ed Davey the Systems Act. This is the systems architecture, and his successors of whatever hue for the next 15 years. I believe an architect is needed. I don't think it should be inside government. I think it should be outside government. It should be done by the right folks outside government. But I do agree with you, the government needs to tell us that this is the sort of thing that's required. Governments worry about appearing to interfere with markets. I can understand that. But they need to explain to us the difference between consumer goods as a market and energy as a market, and why we need to structure things in different ways.
Neil?
Right, I suppose the wood chip question. The wood chip market and the RHI market grew last year by 350%. So I think that you may see some large-scale biomass things threatened over time, but I think you will see an underlying growth, and you might see lots of people installing wood pellet and wood chip boilers, especially the interesting stat, which I didn't hear before tonight, that heat consumption is such a big part of everyone's domestic life. Ultimately, the technology has to be there to enable wood to be a more efficient source of energy. Calorie for calorie, I think wood is actually cheaper than most fossil fuels. It's 67 quid per dry tonne, and I think if you analyse the calorific value of that against other fuels, it is basically cheap. We're just not very good at handling it. So the crystal ball doesn't work out sort of 15, 20 years hence, but you need technologies to come in that are going to drive down the cost of that renewable power. Otherwise, ultimately, there'll be other forms. But I think wood and biomass will always play a part because, to be frank with you, we are going to need everything, all sorts of renewables, if we are going to get anywhere near the targets that we've been set and have legally obligated ourselves to chase. And it ain't coming from nuclear in the short term.
Alistair?
If I can start with the target story, I've got enormous sympathy with the questioner. It is an urban myth, I think. I'm not sure. The urban myth that I would use to show this is the day that the Prime Minister signed our commitment in Europe, and he came out of the signing meeting and said, well, I've signed it to a civil servant. And they said, well, what did you sign? Well, I've signed 20% of energy. And they said, well, no, we wanted 20% of electricity. So, of course, it ended up that we'd signed 37% of electricity. It is an urban myth, but I think it's a perfect example of just how difficult the whole targets debate is. And they do keep changing. Let me just take the role of government question. Here's the good news. The 2013 Electricity Act has introduced a strategic policy report, which is going to effectively provide the umbrella for each government at the beginning of a government term as to what their energy policy will be. And that, certainly from a regulator's point of view, will be very helpful. It'll be interesting to see whether the government can then stick to it. But at least the positioning of the current government, I think, is a good one in creating that product. If I just very quickly deal with cost of capital, we see some very interesting tensions in the network companies between the British listed stocks who need equity and quite often the overseas companies who are driven by debt and driven by very different reasons. Up to date, we've been able to contain that through the regulated cost of capital. These are very interesting questions that you raise about what would happen in a marketplace if a Chinese or a Russian investor using a different cost of capital because it's different reasons that are driving their investment were to take a very major position in our sector.
Thank you. Michael?
The sovereign wealth funds, the question about the sovereign wealth funds to invest in energy, again it goes down to what will happen there with the political interference or lack of it. So they also like to have a sort of a secure, if you like, return on their investment. And sovereign wealth funds are chased by many, many different investors, and particularly attractive investments in energy in general exist in the emerging markets in Asia Pacific, South Asia, and so on and so forth. So right now they do quite a lot of their business in the region. If you look at the Qatari fund, at the Emirati fund, at the Singaporean fund, etc., etc. So they may be prepared to accept a lower return perhaps if they invest in Europe, but they probably require some sort of a security about this return, not a switching all the time of government decision, if you like. A little bit about the role of government. Yes, I agree that the role of government should become a lot more prominent. We see that the government gets involved in getting us exactly how many pieces of fruit and vegetable we have to eat every day, and they are involved in very prominent campaigns in the UK, all around the world. I haven't seen this level of education appearing in terms of energy. So I think it's very important to make everybody a lot more aware. The news that we get about energy is how we get ripped off, or all the floods, etc., etc. This is only the negative things about energy, nothing about how we ourselves be able to help, if you like, resolve the problem. Can the UK deliver with the help of EU? I think that's quite a big question. I think the gentleman over there asked it, or in spite of the EU. I was having a look at some of the international reports on energy sustainability and reading the individual profiles of every European country. It's quite interesting, to say the least. Each European country has its own priorities, its own energy mix. It's a very, very complicated picture. You know, the problems that Germany faces right now with the choices it decided to make. Again, I would go back to something that the commentator said about would interconnectivity be better or worse? You know, if Germany needs the electricity, you know, why wouldn't it push it further down to France or to Switzerland or to everybody else? The gentleman regarding the wood chips, I think also it is a very good business, but not only wood chips, there are a lot more things that could be processed and burned further on to provide small pockets of supply. And this would be, for example, waste. I'm not sure we do enough about waste. And again, I refer you to the model of Denmark, which is very interesting because that's the other big source, recycling or burning, if you like, municipal waste. I don't know the technology behind it, but it sounds certainly very interesting. Thank you.
Before I hand over to Angela, I'd just like to ask all of you, you know, tonight I think we've very much focused on can we or can't we sort this problem out. I'd like hands up those who are more optimistic than when they came in. And hands up those who are more pessimistic than when they came in. And just for completeness, those who came in and are probably going to leave in the same view. Interesting, okay. So very much split both ways, very interesting. Angela, would you like to sum up in a minute or two?
Yes, I think I'll just pick up 2 points, if I may, in summing up. The first is who is investing in this? And I know that the questioner said, what about sovereign wealth funds? If we look at electricity generation, about a third of our capacity is from independent generators. It's nothing to do with the big six. And that third is in fact growing. And so, that's a good thing. More coming in, different investors, different companies. If you look behind that, you do find that what is happening behind that investment is it's people who are prepared to take a risk. So in fact, it is getting risky, and especially on the build side. If you've got something which the asset has been built and it looks like it's going to give a decent return, then that's when you get in the big, you know, the sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds. But at the moment, the cost of build and the risk premium associated means that it's only those who are prepared to take a punt. The price is high, but we are getting, you know, more involved. It's a very mixed picture. And so that brings me to the second point that I want to make. And this is the last one, and it is the role of government. What a role of government should play in the energy industry, which is a major economic and essential business for the UK. The role of government is to set a clear and doable and understandable framework. Within that, you can then put a target because that target is achievable. But if you make it a political issue in which every time something you don't like, you jump on, then all you're doing is, in effect, tearing up that sensible framework. So what one requires is government to be pragmatic, realistic, talk properly about the whole soup to nuts of energy, link the cost of bill to what you pay on the bill, and have that framework out there and stick to it. If we do that, we've got something that'll work. If we don't do that, we haven't. We'll always be going back to the start again.
Excellent. Well, I'm certainly not going to try and sum up what has been a fascinating discussion, and my thanks to all of you for that. I would, I think, just to recap a few points before we close. We opened with the trilemma of controlling supply, trying to beat these carbon targets, and to control price. And I think the very fact that we were talking about controlling price, I think we conceded very early on. You called it, we already have a Chinese market, Angela. This question about it's definitely not a free market out there. And therefore, I'm not surprised we're ending on government policy and regulation. I found it a bit distressing to some degree that we were still talking about whether or not security of supply should or shouldn't be in. Should it be RPI minus X? Should it be rate of return? What about CMAs? Or here in the city, we're discussing policy performance bonds. But it is also interesting that all of these are mechanisms from people who are crying out for certainty, clarity, and simplicity of policy. And I think that's where we really end, as you just did. That is what's missing. So in this huge jigsaw that we're trying to manage, it's probably not the technologies. It's very much our inability to agree on what we're going to stick to in terms of rewarding people who invest in this market. And I guess what bothers me about all this is whilst I think the world traders and many other people, and yourself, Angela, and the panelists, have been trying to inject a sense of urgency into this, it does seem to be lacking as we go on time and time again without people committing to one policy. The US comedian George Carlin said when Thomas Edison worked late into the night on the electric light, he had to do it by gas lamp or candle. I'm sure it made the work seem that much more urgent. So I think it would be nice if we had an urgency about policy and perhaps less raw urgency about technology and innovation. Although deferring, Hugh, to the fact that it's a great place to do it. May I say in closing, thanks. It's difficult to thank everyone who was involved in this. I'd like to thank all of you guests. I'd particularly like to thank amongst you the various students who are staying up late with us, so thank you for coming along. I'd like to thank the AV team and the facilities. I would like to thank Cass for hosting this, which has been inordinately generous. I would like to thank, and I can't thank you all individually, all of the various world traders who've contributed to tonight, whether it's holding microphones or organizing events or taking questions. But I'd particularly like to turn to one of the world traders, Dr. Heather McLaughlin, who opened with, when would we know we have a working energy policy, which I think is actually the question that we ended on. And Angela opened almost answering it directly dull. I wish you'd left the banking industry dull, but anyway.
Duller than when I arrived.
Duller than when I arrived. Point taken. But it would be great if Angela does leave the energy industry extremely dull and with a sense of urgency in the next few years. But if I could thank all of you for everything, and may I, in particular, ask you to join me in thanking the people who made it all possible, Angela with her speech, and our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.